Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we're going to be talking through our top 10 podcast moments of 2020. I have a special guest today, someone who is instrumental in bringing you the podcast each and every week, but doesn't usually join us on camera. I'm happy to welcome Tom Kwon, who, in addition to writing the articles you read each week on Future of Field Service, produces this here podcast. Hey, Tom.
Hey, yeah, no, thank you for actually having me on camera. It's weird to not be muted and hidden away. So
in the background.
First time, long time here. It's great to it's great to call into the show.
I think it's fun, and Tom isn't visible on camera, but he listens to each and every conversation in the background, multiple times actually, live as we record it, and then again a few times as he does all of the editing. So just as much as I have enjoyed the conversations we've been able to have with all of our guests in 2020, Tom has been there for each and every one of them as well. So I thought it would be interesting for us today to take a listen through some of our favorite moments and reflect back on why we felt they were so important. But it was really hard to pick, right, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, we've had obviously at this point 50 fantastic conversations over the course of just this year, across a variety of different industries, across a variety of different use cases for service. So it's been so interesting to get that level of diverse perspectives, but it makes it really hard to narrow it down.
It does.
to just 10 to. I mean, there's some as we go through. There's a couple that where I was like, okay, this was definitely one of the best conversations that we had this year, but. We have so many great conversations. It's definitely a challenge to really narrow it down to a couple.
Absolutely. And, I think while the diverse views have been enjoyable, it's also always interesting to me, despite the diversity, to see how much these folks have in common. And so I think these moments will resonate with quite a few people. And we had to do it because I've been told that a top 25 list just does not pull as well from a headline perspective. So here we are. All right. So number one on the list, we had on Peloton, Jamie Beck, who's the Senior Vice President of Field Operations at Peloton. And to me, this was such a impactful moment because, just hearing how a brand like Peloton is investing in field service, really illustrated for me just how much potential there is here. So let's take a listen to what Jamie had to share.
So you and I connected, Jamie, and talked a bit about the Peloton story as it relates to service. And I love it because I think it is a really good illustration of a lot of the trends we see right now with companies in all different industries recognizing the opportunity that exists to use service as a strategic differentiator. And so this story is very representative of that. And I think it's a very interesting one to dig into, how field service is such a valuable tool in being the face of a brand, right? So let's talk a bit about that. So, you mentioned that you joined the company after the decision was made to invest in field operations and field service. So can you talk a bit about some of the reasons that the company's leadership felt it was important to make that investment?
Sure. As I think back, there's probably three reasons that I think about. And so John Foley, our CEO, they started selling bikes in 2014. And as we started to deliver them, one of the early, important things as a company was to put our members first. We call all of our customers members, and really to deliver to them a great brand experience. And I think John took a look to say, hey, how can we make this delivery experience better than what we're currently doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started with a pilot in the New York area in order to test this out. Can we deliver better brand experience than what we're currently doing? And so I think that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing was, we know that over time, these are big, bulky products, and they're bikes, and they could break. And so I think the investment in field service was not only about the delivery, but I think thinking ahead to how are we going to service these,
Mm-hmm.
And how can we control that experience so that our members have a great experience, not only on the delivery, but also on the repair and service, so that we can get into their homes and fix them quickly. I often equate it to, if your iPhone breaks, you take it to the Apple store.
Mm-hmm.
If something goes wrong with your Peloton, you can't simply put it into your car and drive it to one of our showrooms.
Mm-hmm.
We have to come to you. The third thing I think was, and I think this was John's, foresight as a leader, was, this is back in 2015 when this category was really just being created. Competition was going to come. If we're successful, competition is going to come. And so it's an investment in field operations. Obviously there's probably cheaper ways that we could do this, but we knew that by investing in this field operations team, delivering this great brand experience, being able to service and repair your products, it helps put a strategic moat around what we were doing as a business.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those three things are really what we thought about, what John thought about when we decided to make this investment in field operations.
So there's two things Jamie says that really just hit home for me. The first is how the field experience impacts brand perception, right? And how powerful it can be to have field teams have such an impact on the brand experience. The second thing, and I love the term he uses, strategic moat, the idea of service as a strategic moat for the business. And, really just the idea of service as a strategic differentiator. So really cool thoughts. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, something I've written about a couple times on the website, has been the concept of everything as a service. And I think Peloton, by its nature, is engineered that way.
Mm-hmm.
You're subscribing to watch the the classes as they're happening, and there's obviously gamification built into that as well. But anytime, it's really forward thinking to understand that for a company, especially a company that's putting a device with a lot of moving parts into customer houses,
Mm-hmm.
that's not where service ends. Service, that's a component. That's one half of it. That's the non-field component of it. And then the other half of it is actually, what happens when, and Jamie, over the course of the longer conversation that you have, discusses the steps that go into the introduction of the bike to someone's home.
Mm-hmm.
How they, if you've never ridden, a spinning bicycle, how to attach the thing to your foot and all that. I don't know the terminology. I've never done it. But so that component of it, and then the break fix component of it, and then they don't really talk about this, but if there's a sunset component or an upgrade component, I'm sure that's part of it as well.
Right.
And understanding that service doesn't begin and end with the subscription.
Mm-hmm.
It's a broader piece, and it's absolutely a necessary differentiator. And I think Jamie rightly says that it's the face of your business.
Right.
So yeah. It's nice to see Peloton taking an approach that, I hate the term future proof, though I use it all the time, but I hate it. But considering that strategic landscape from beyond what it looks like today.
Yeah, I agree. And, in that episode, there's also an interesting discussion about the ways that they empower their field teams to deliver the type of experience they want them to. So it's well worth a listen. It's episode 73, if anyone wants to go back and hear the full conversation. Number 2 of our 10 moments is Munters discussing remote assistance. So this is episode 55, and this is Roel Rentmeesters, who's the director of global customer service at Munters. We did a lot with this story this year because Munters acted very quickly as COVID began to deploy IFS remote assistance, which is a merged reality solution, to be able to really quite adeptly, react to the COVID circumstances and use it for business continuity while also setting the stage for their longer term servitization objectives. So let's hear one of the points that Roel makes on this episode.
Last question for you is, what advice can you share with our listeners on, what you've learned from managing this situation and maybe anything you can share for their consideration?
What I would say is there is technologies that don't take years to implement. There is things that can go really, really fast. If you have a partner like IFS who listens to you, responds to your needs, is flexible enough to help you test it for a while, etc., you can see that things like this can, in less than a month, 2 weeks' time for the 200 technicians, you can implement the tool, provide them access, give them the training, develop an offering around it, and have it work. So I would encourage people to look into such technologies as well that are not so expensive as you think and very easy to implement with a very big return.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot more to Munters' story than this one clip. But the reason I chose this clip is because I think that in general, there can be some overthinking that goes on when we're making changes. And then when you combine that with, the panic and pressure everyone was feeling in the March timeframe, I give Roel and Munters a lot of credit for pushing through all of that and just acting really fast in putting a tool in place that has helped them immensely in navigating such crazy times. As he says, they deployed remote assistance to 200 technicians across 20 countries in just 2 weeks. And they've obviously continued expanding that since. But, reacting fast and getting moving, really helped them to experience the situation of this year far differently than they would have. And I just think it's a good point that, yes, some technology investments, are pretty involved and you need to be very pragmatic and, whatnot. But, there are things that you can do very, quickly as well that have a really big impact. Tom, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that's a really good point. I think that I remember a couple years ago attending an AR-oriented, like an AR-only conference.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the prevailing wisdom at the time was that AR, as an emerging technology, was going to fall into sort of like a gimmicky category or an overtly complex category.
Mm-hmm.
I think what smart businesses are learning to do is balance the two. And basically not that it's a gimmick, but it's a utility that is very easy to initially implement.
Mm-hmm.
Either and Munters is they're a great example of a company that took it seriously and did it well.
Mm-hmm.
Pilot it first in one country, and then sort of push it out from there. But by implementing it easily and building on that foundation, from there you can look at the infrastructure, you can look at the tools that you're using to access the augmented reality tools.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at the way that you're employing, shared view versus pre-recorded or predetermined instructions and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can build on it and take what is out of the box,
Mm-hmm.
For Munters, an essential tool, and turn it into a long-term asset and a differentiator for your service business.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, let's go on to moment number 3, which is Cisco on customer experience and when to disrupt. So this is Kwon, who is the Vice President of Customer Experience at Cisco. It's episode 76, and I really loved the point he made here. So let's have a listen, and then we can talk about it.
So as you've been on this journey, in identifying these needs and working as a business to, pivot and adapt to restructure to be able to meet them, are there any lessons you've learned or tips you would share for other organizations that are kind of doing this work of, exploring the customer journey, looking for opportunities to provide new and different services, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that come to my mind is timing, because we had professional services and technical services, and they were both very successful businesses on their own right. It was a separate organization, but very successful businesses. But we could see in the longer term that we needed that customer success function as well, and we needed to bring the teams together. It was a very difficult decision, but we needed to make it at that time. And, we couldn't afford to wait until these businesses started to slow down. So, but as you can imagine at that time, when you have very successful large businesses, it's hard to make that decision to disrupt, because you're disrupting a lot of people, a lot of organizations. And I think I once described it as we put everything into a box, shook it, turned it upside down, and then put it down, and then we started from there. Right? It sort of felt that way at the time. But having that courage to disrupt early on, I think is really important. It can be very risky and scary, but if you do that, then you have a very strong business that's sort of slowing down, plateauing. But if you make that transformation at the right time, then you can, go through that growth curve again. I think that, so timing is so important, and having the courage to disrupt earlier is really important.
So if you listen to this full episode, what Say is basically talking about is that Cisco had a very successful technical services business and a very successful professional services business, but identified a gap in between. So there was kind of a point in the customer journey that was not at all being addressed. And they knew that if they could redesign the business and restructure things a bit, they would be able to address the need their customers had. But to do so, to his point, they really had to shake things up that were running very smoothly, performing very well. But I just loved this point, because I think that, when things are going poorly, it's easy to identify the need to make a change or the need to innovate. But the opportunity can be there even when things are going well. And, if you trudge along with if it isn't broke, don't fix it mentality, you can miss an opportunity to really transform the business into something new, something bigger, something different. So I just love this point about having the courage to take risks and, not being afraid of that disruption. What are your thoughts, Tom?
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I think the if it isn't broke, don't fix it mentality ignores invisible issues, right? And that's, we're currently living with a virus where people are walking around not realizing that they're sick for 4 or 5 days, and it's sort of the same thing. Is that you're not necessarily sure what damage is being inflicted under the hood. based on those processes, and maybe that's a long-term issue that's going to manifest itself after 5-10 years under some circumstances. So taking a step back and being able to audit where you are right now, and adjust processes, and we know how difficult that can be for individual contributors, right? We see this all the time with technicians who, and we're actually going to talk about it in a minute with respect to KONE. With technicians who struggle with new processes, taking that a step, or multiple steps higher to the organizational level and saying we need to disrupt our own processes, to build better, not tactically, but strategically. That's a really brave decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's, I think there's a lot of those conversations happening right now, and so I just thought it was a really timely message from Say to, have the courage and don't be afraid of making, taking some risk. So, okay, let's move on. So number 4 is Henrietta Haavisto, who's the head of service transformation change management at KONE. This was episode 45. And I met Henrietta at Field Service Europe last year. And someone having the title head of service transformation change management, I'm like, we should talk because obviously this is, something that comes up all the time. So let's hear what Henrietta has to say.
What about tips for executing? I mean, is there certain best practices or certain aspects that you feel are really important to executing well?
I think, definitely. There's first of all clarity. So we need to be really clear on why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to get there? And I know I'm repeating myself a little here, but it's actually really common to see that it's actually quite unclear to everyone involved why we're doing something. Everybody just assumes that somebody else knows. But unless you're really clear about what are we trying to do and breaking that down into solid, deliverables or actions with clear owners, clear follow-ups, that's the way you actually kind of install it as part of the kind of normal way of working and that everyday life to make change happen. Then I think prioritization is another thing. Because I think, when we talk about change management, typically, we might think, well, it's just my program or it's just my strategy execution or it's just this bit. But the reality is that, and when we talk about, for example, our field people, they're hit by so many changes constantly because it's rarely a company has just one department working just on developing, tools or new services or such. But typically in a certain size company, you actually have a lot of different programs developing different types of initiatives and those kind of projects that hit then, for example, a field technician. And there to be able to really prioritize and bring that clarity on, what do we need to do first? Or how can we bundle these changes together? Or, what's really critical for our customers that we get it done as quickly as possible? How can we best help them to succeed them? Or, from our people perspective on the field, what would help them the most? And then using that as a way of, prioritizing and bringing that clarity as well in making sure that we execute successfully.
So, you hear every conversation for this podcast, Tom. So how much change management comes up. It's literally a part of almost every single conversation that I have with service leaders. And it's an area that it deserves a lot of conversation because it is commonly either overlooked or underprioritized or deprioritized or, screwed up, right? And it comes up in so many conversations because it's something that I think is challenging to get right. And I think this is Henrietta's specialty. This entire episode is worth listening to. She has a lot of good advice. She talks about a lot of the common missteps, but to me, I think the bottom line is, it's really a respect thing, in my opinion. Respecting the fact that change is hard for people, and that doesn't make your people difficult or bad. It's just human nature, and getting ahead of that and having enough respect for your people to sort through how to manage change well is well worth the effort and time, and will pay dividends based on countless conversations that I've heard of people getting this part wrong. What would you add?
Yeah, and so I think that Henrietta, she's a great example. We have so many conversations over the course, over the course of any given amount of time, where we see different strategies for how to handle this well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the two pillars being clarity and prioritization here are not necessarily unique, but it's important to highlight those specifically, especially clarity. And there was a conversation that we had, again, this was over a year ago now. You and I were on with I don't even think this was for the podcast. I think this was for other things, but with a pest control company who. And the gentleman with whom we were speaking made it clear that any rollout of a new initiative became a company event. The firm was shut down company wide, or it was rolled out to different divisions at different times. On a specific day, everyone was trained up on it, and the value of any new tool was articulated appropriately at that time. Part of that is the prioritization piece too, right? Is knowing which battles to fight at which time. And a lot of times, if you're being clear and concise, and you're building player coaches within the actual practitioners of your tools, that clarity will inform the priorities.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I also think people, when I talk to people about change management, it's always like, you can't over communicate, right? Which is true, but that gives the assumption that communication equals clarity, right? And they're not necessarily one and the same, right? You can communicate, but you can do that without giving people the clarity they need. And I think that the two areas of clarity that I've heard time and time again are most critical are clarity in why the change is being made, and in particular, why as it pertains to that individual person's role and outcome. And then what's expected. People want to know what's expected of them. People want to know, how they're going to be, assessed. And so I think, communication is critical, but to Henrietta's point, clarity in what you're communicating, needs to be considered. So anyway, that's a topic I could talk about all day. But for the sake of time, we'll move along to number 5, which is Professor Tim Baines of Aston Business School's Advanced Services Group, discussing the forces behind servitization. So let's hear what Tim has to say.
And where you are today with servitization, it's really about a shift in our understanding of what it looks like to be a manufacturing business. Because the bottom line is that for many industries, the model of production and consumption, make, buy, make, sell, dump. That's gone. The rich carbon-based business models of the past in many industries are on a very limited timeline. What's happening is society is moving away from the consumption of products, moving towards the consumption of services. And you see that trend in all the international performance indicators. Developed economies like the UK, like the States, like they're service-based economies. And servitization is all about manufacturing businesses responding to that shift in the societal appetite for services over society's appetite for product, and not just services which are about repairing a product or providing spare parts for a product, but services which provide outcomes. So when you think about the big picture that we're seeing, servitization to me is this shift towards this new emerging paradigm about what it means to be a manufacturing business. And most industries will get into that paradigm sooner or later. And when you think about the forces which are causing it to happen, it's the same forces which have shaped the paradigms for manufacturing over the past 200 years. They are the pull from society coupled with the technological innovations. And those, innovation takes place as the interplay between market pull and technology push. And that's what we're seeing. And manufacturing businesses and a lot of service businesses are all being caught up in this. Though they might not recognize it, that's what's actually happening. So when you think about service transformation inside a business, two of the big macro pressures which are determining what's going to happen are these two sets of forces on the outside. There are others, but they're the two which are first and foremost to keep in mind that change is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just really the only thing you have control over is to some extent the rate at which it's going to happen.
All right. Tom, you go first this time. I'm sure our audience is sick of hearing me talk anyway.
I mean, it seems unlikely if they're subscribing to the show, but that's fine. Yeah, you know what? I think that this is daunting. This is threatening to to certain areas of manufacturing. Certainly that for him to say that almost all businesses will need to embrace some element of service-oriented thinking. And think about service not in terms of break fix like many of these manufacturers have traditionally, but think about it as a component of of outcomes. And the business model makes sense, and there's hundreds and hundreds of reasons why manufacturing is changing. Technological reasons, regulatory reasons, economic reasons. The list goes on and on and on. Service, though, can function as a safety net for some businesses, and that's not to say that it's a cure-all, but it can help ballast a business that needs to reorganize themselves in certain ways. But that's not something that you can't just flip the service switch in order to get there. It's a multi-year process.
Right. It's funny because the first thing you said is it's daunting, and the first thing I think is it's exciting. And it's really both, right? I mean, I think this is something that is top of mind for the vast majority of our manufacturing audience. Again, this is part of the conversations I have day in and day out. And I've heard people within the vendor community, so the technology community, say, why are we still talking about servitization? That's been a buzzword for, X number of years. And it's because it's not a buzzword. It's a fundamental change in how these companies do business in many different aspects, right? And so it just takes time for that to all come to fruition. It takes time, and it takes a lot of hard work, so the thing is, it's a journey. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And so I don't think that there's any way to race through to from being a product provider to, a service, outcomes-based service extraordinaire. But, I think it's something that everyone's thinking about. And I think the Advanced Services Group's research is some of the best I've seen in really speaking the language of the industry and, outlining the important considerations and some of that path in a way that makes sense. So well worth having a listen. That's episode 70. And we recently had Tim back to share some predictions for 2021. And we have plans to have Tim back many more times because there's a lot to dig into related to servitization. Thanks for listening, everyone. We are going to pick up where we left off next week. So be sure to come back and join us for the second half of our top 10 episode next week. As always, thanks for listening.